Hello, everybody. Welcome to our latest deep dive. This is our first one that is not on the vector sequencer, which is kind of mind-blowing. I actually don't even have the vector in my screenshot. Let me make sure I've got... Okay, I've got a video playing in the background somewhere. There we go. Always those little...
Oh, how about that local sports team?
Yeah. So, joining me today are my good friends, collaborators. Steve Turner, all the way from Melbourne, Australia. Steve, it's like 3 a.m. in the morning there, right?
It's 8 a.m. on a Sunday, which feels like 3 a.m. any other day. So, yeah.
Okay. And also with us today are our special guest, Chris Meyer. And he is appearing as himself and as his performing hat, Alias Zone. And we're going to be listening to some unreleased music from Chris later this afternoon.
Yeah, it's the most recent track I just finished up and I got to use the QVL on, so it was great.
Excellent. And you did this on the Monster system, correct?
I did it on the Monster modular, yeah, which has had a big shift in modulation modules since the QVL came out. There's a pair of QVLs in there and replaced about a half a dozen other modules.
That is crazy. I'll give everybody a little preview of that patch. Spotlight that for a second.
That's not the craziest it's been, actually, but it's pretty complex. There was at least 4 voices going out to that machine.
Lovely.
Yeah, we'll be breaking that down in detail later on in the show.
Excellent. Let me just adjust my screen a little bit so I can see how things are going on the chat.
It's just a comment. Sorry, just some housekeeping here. The emergency exits are to your left and right. And someone's just saying that maybe someone's mic is rubbing on their shirt or something like that. Or there's some kind of noise coming through one of the mics.
It might be me. I have a misbehaving headphone cable that causes noise.
Ah, okay. All right. Cool.
There. Hopefully that's better.
And one more detail before we get into the deepness of the deep dive. Running a flash sale on the QVL right now. This will be on until, I don't know, sometime... Where's the spotlight? There is a spotlight. Until, we'll say, Sunday midnight-ish. Unless I forget, in which case it'll be Monday something. But
which time zone?
Mountain time zone.
There you go. Just think it's already Sunday for Steve.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. Well, it would be then that would be Monday night for our Australian friends.
And Japanese?
Yes, about the same. Yep. So that's going on, and cool. All right. So, any more comments from the chat line, Steve, before I flip over to the
just more. There's a couple of comments. Sorry, Chris, that your mic is very hot compared to the levels of others. Now, we did do sound checks prior to starting, but there are always little random things that'll pop up, obviously. So, excuse us for a sec, guys.
I just knocked it down a couple dB, and hopefully that's a little bit more in line.
How's that, guys? Obviously, they're about 30 seconds behind us, so the answer to that will be forthcoming. But thanks, Chris. Sorry, mate.
No problems.
Okay, here we go, Steve. Exciting. This time I'm not going to forget.
Very good. Yay. Good one, Jim.
Just for those of you who aren't familiar with my my deep dive tutorials, usually I forget to zoom on the screen. So
maybe down a couple more dB, Chris. There, and you're right, Jim. It did feel weird setting up the camera on the rack and not having the vector in the shot. That just felt weird. So, you know.
well, there's a lot more coming with the vector this year, so we'll get to that on the next zoom.
Excellent.
All right, so the patch I'm running now is a variation on a Krell style patch. It's a generative patch, and I won't go into it in detail now. We'll do that, and I'll recreate it towards the end of the live stream. But it shows how you can use the QVL as a control source generator. I've got pitch, gate, two modulation signals. I've cross-patched the QVL into itself to handle resets on, triggers on the sample and hold. The sound's coming from the Osiris, and we're also running into one half of the Weston stereo filter and modulating cutoff on that. So I'm going to turn this patch off for a second, and I'm going to actually go to the presets page and load an initialized preset. So this is what your QVL will likely look like out of the box. So what is this thing? It's a quad variable LFO. It's organized into pairs, so 2 LFOs on the left side and 2 LFOs on the right side. There are animated waveforms on almost every screen to help you keep track of where you are in the UI. On each side, the primary LFO is drawn with a solid line, and the secondary is drawn with a dotted line. And the UI overall is progressive in the sense that when you start it up, the things you need the most are available right away. And then as you need more detail, you just like drop down into edit modes to get to these extra parameters. On the main screen, the default parameters, which you can customize later, you've got the waveform and rate for the primary LFO, so I can just grab these and start messing around with these. We've got a bunch of waveforms, I'll go through those in a minute. And then the rate of LFO2, but you don't have access to the waveform here, but it's right there in terms of the rate, and you can grab that and patch that somewhere right away. Same thing on the right hand side, the waveform, rate of LFO3 as well as LFO4. And then if I want to save a preset, I hold Edit A and Edit B together, and I pick a slot, and we'll put this in slot number 3. I can change the name if I want. Sure, lint sounds good. Go back to trig A, which also says back on the screen to get back to where it was. So we have presets, very handy. I think Chris is very enamored of having presets on an LFO.
Oh, it's a big help in live performance, particularly when you're doing more than one piece during a long set, just to have everything change the configuration that quickly.
Absolutely. All right.
How many presets live, Jim?
I think we're at 48.
40. Oh, yeah. Well,
It's either 48 or 64. I'm getting old and I forget shit, but it's in banks of 8s, and you can also load and save banks of 8s to files on an SD card. There is an SD card on the back. All right, so I want to dive into LFO1 a little bit, so I'm going to press Edit A to go down on the A side edit. So waveforms, we have waveform rate, shape, range, and phase. The waveforms, we have basic waveforms, sine, triangle, sawtooth up and down, shark tooth up and down, square waves, so forth and so on. All of these have a shape parameter. So for the sine wave, it kind of flattens it out and pinches at the bottom, or the reverse, it starts to narrow at the top and widen on the bottom end, with 50 being the middle. And then for the triangle, it's a similar process. Getting ahead a little bit, all of these things can be modulated, the shape parameters. Sawtooths, Kind of squeeze those around. And of course for the square wave, you can adjust the phase. And I forget exactly the percentage on the shortest one, but it's quite short. And in the Krell style patch that I'll build up later, I use this as basically my my master clock source. We have sample and hold. We'll go into that a little more detail later, but one of the nice things about sample and hold is that you can have something in the system trigger it, either the gate inputs or other LFOs, and then the source of what you're sampling, right now it's random, it could be any of the CV inputs or any of the other LFOs, which is great for building generative patches. We have some morphing waveforms, so this one goes from triangle to sine and back. So they're another nice thing if you like to have a lot of subtle modulation on things. Sawtooth to triangle, sawtooth to square. And then we have some stair-step waves where the shape controls the number of steps. So let me slow that down a little bit.
So if anyone, yeah, there you go. That's a good resolution there. That shows the steps and the quantity being modulated there.
Yeah. So we have steps up, down, and up, down. And then these I call sequenced waves. Basically, it moves between the waves in a discontinuous fashion. So this is a good way to get somewhat more, I don't want to say chaotic because we're talking a lot about chaotic waves today, but unusual discontinuous waves.
Would you say that it, as you dial the shape, it sort of rolls between the different wave types? So if you had like a saw and then a sine, it morphs between those two. Is that kind of how shape works on the one you just showed us?
On the earlier ones with the arrows,
Yep.
this is a
That one. Yep.
continuous morph. This is a
Yeah.
crossfade.
Continuous versus discontinuous.
Yeah, on these it's discontinuous. So as you cross between different shapes, right, you get those hard jumps. And so this is a setup that begs for modulation.
Excellent. Yes.
Say from a sample and hold. Okay, now we get to our official chaotic generators, of which there's 2 are chaotic algorithms. The first one is the Lorenz attractor, and there are both analog and digital versions of this. I don't know enough about math, history, and electronics to say who came first, but the Lorenz system is a set of 3 differential equations that are related to a lot of things like weather prediction and so forth. The nice thing about them is they make really good sources for modulation where you want things to change but in an unpredictable fashion without it being random. And I think Chris has also a couple of words about the nature of a chaotic generator versus a pure random signal.
Yeah, I'll be touching on that during my demo, yeah.
Okay, good. So we'll get deeper into that. I also use the Lorenz waveform in the Krell type patch I built. Next up we have a Perlin noise algorithm, which is technically a set of, I think this one has 8 random linear waveforms that are added together, and it gives you this kind of random walk or terrain type of view to things. And this is a good source for when you want to add randomization to some other signal, and I use this waveform also in my my Krell type patch. Last in this list is the logistic modular chaotic function, which it's kind of a weird sample and hold. I'm still learning this one, and I expect there'll be some updates to this algorithm soon. So that is our full tour of all the waveforms. Next up we have rate. I'm sorry, the rate, and over on the right next to it the range. So the range says how the rate behaves. So we have a wide range that goes from a little below 1 hertz, 0.071 hertz, all the way up to, I think we're at 103 hertz. And then there is also a slow range, which goes all the way down to 0.0011 hertz, and then maxes out at 1.6 hertz. So for some very, very slow waveforms, we have that option. We have a hertz option, which is mostly for just pretty fast things. If you're going to be doing some using one of these for ring modulation, it's useful for that. 16th note, beat, and bar type patterns. And Steve's going to be showing these synchronized to his vector.
So when you're talking about music divisions like 16th, beat, and bar, that's relative to either the internal clock, which we'll talk about, or your synced source, or even a gated pulse input as well. So your musical divisions can be connected various different ways.
Yes, and something that's not in the current firmware release, but we're going to try and get out next week, is I've added a PLL function to these. So as you change the rate of any musical-based division, it will kind of automatically relock to whatever time base you're using, whether it's the vector or an internal clock. And again, this is part of Steve's demo coming up. Bring this back to wide. Shape we've kind of already talked about. Phase is something that is often you don't need it, but when you need it, you really need it. So for example, if you're using a beat synced waveform, the phase lets you control where the waveform is in its range on the downbeat, or wherever it resets. Or again, if you're using an external reset on a waveform, it will say where does it reset to. Also, you can use it as a modulation target to get some subtle shape variation. So if I speed up the sine wave a little bit and just kind of manually mess with the phase, you can see that I can kind of get some subtle shape variation going on.
So what I love about this is the fact that you can then take those things, like if you wanted to have the phase on the main screen as one of your customized knob sort of assignments, you can do that really easily as well, which I'm sure you'll get to. But it really adds to the performability of the QVL, because if you're having fun in one of the screens modulating something like the phase or the shape, you could then assign that as a custom allocation to the knobs on the main screen, and then during your performance you could be just wiggling away with that as well. And also you could make it a modulation target for an external or an internal LFO, whatever you wanted as well.
Yeah, no, definitely, in the overall design, having the top level page here as your performance page is is a primary goal, right? Because Chris and I have both been performing live with these, and as anybody who's performed live with modular knows, or even just in the studio trying to do a live recording of a piece, is that if the more customized and optimized your setup in terms of knowing where to make your moves during the piece, it makes life a lot easier. Okay,
Definitely.
back into, that's it for the edit page, and when I hit the B button, I'm now on the edit page for the other side, so it's LFO3, LFO1, LFO3. On the A side, I push once more, I'm now on the output control side. And this is all about having the signals coming out of the QVL be optimized for wherever they're going. In particular, often you will have an attenuator on a CV input. Say if in this case I'm going to the cutoff and the filter, and I've got a pot here for that. But for other options like decay, I think this acts as an attenuator, but I know there are other spots on here. Well, resonance, for instance, you don't have an input attenuator. So we have attenuator built into the QVL. Right-hand corner here, level. We also have an offset control.
Yeah. Not only is that handy for modules that don't have their own input attenuators, and as modules get smaller or people try to cut costs, that's an issue. It's another thing that's really handy with presets to be able to quickly change. Hey, this is now going into a lower range for the filter. Now this next preset is going to a higher range for the filter without having to go over and touch the filter. It's saved in the preset. So having the offset and level built in has been a real boon.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely a big help. Also, there's the source control. Now, all there are 4 LFOs and 2 envelopes internally, and some LFO shapes, particularly the Lorentz attractor, has 3 outputs. It's a set of 3 equations, you get 3 outputs. So rather than having you pick one shape for another for the other one, if I go back and I say this is the Lorentz, and in output 1 I say it's LFO1, and we can see the output there. But if I jump ahead to output 2, I can say that its output is actually one of the other outputs, the Y or the Z output.
So let me just jump in for a sec. I just want to make clear, because Jim's done something really cool there. The outputs at the bottom of the QVL, the 4 outputs, you can assign to any of the LFOs as sources. So just because it's output 1, 2, 3, or 4 doesn't mean that it's connected to LFO 1, 2, 3, or 4. You can connect any of the outputs to any of the LFO sources. And what Jim's also saying is you can drill into the LFO itself if it's got more than one kind of mathematical output happening and assign that particular element to an output as well. So that really enables you to have, say, a single LFO, but be outputting it in various different ways, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Or let's say you're using an LFO as a modulation source and you don't need that CV output for it. You can assign an alternate output on a different LFO, or use one of the envelopes as an output. So that's that slight piece of unusuality, the ability to change the source for each output. Also, there's an operation, and there are some simple operations here: invert and rectify and inverted rectify. This is a half rectify, so it clips everything below 0 volts, and just the top half comes through, and the same thing on the reverse half. So these are all simple operations you can perform on the waveform, again, to help it more closely match the target you're going after or the style of the modulation you're after that doesn't quite fit for offset and level. And then finally, there's a scaler that will scale it to be unipolar, 0 to 5 volts. And you can do that and be inverted or below 0 and inverted. So again, just basically utility functions, but because they're built in, it can save you from having to patch in another module. And since it's all tied into the presets, as Chris says, you can have, your different output processing available in different presets.
Yeah, it's like having a set of utility mixers in addition to having a quad LFO. So I know some people get scared off at anything bigger than 8 HP these days, but this has, again, replaced several modules in my big system.
Okay, so I'm going to reset things here a little bit, and I'm just going to give a quick modulation demo. And then, so navigation again, push trig A to go backwards, or if you're down in the menu somewhere, hold trig A and it'll take you back to the main screen. If you're working with LFOs 1 and 2, you're hitting edit A to move between them, back and forth, or if you need to jump over to the other side, edit B, again, back and forth. Trig A and hold to get back to the starting point. So we have the LFO1's parameter pages and outputs, 2's parameters and outputs, and then we have the modulation pages, and there are actually 4 modulation slots per side. I've yet to actually use all of them, but I know how it goes with people who are into modulation. They always want more modulation options. So I'm just going to show one of the most basic ones, which is also a really good way to get an interesting waveform. So LFO 1 and 2 are both sine waves. I'm going to say the source is LFO 2 and the destination is R mod of 1. So it's now ring modulating or multiplying LFO 1. I'm going to go back to the main page, and now I'm going to start adjusting the rate of the 2 LFO. So if I speed up the main LFO, and then I have a slower secondary LFO, you get kind of this interesting heartbeat type thing. Or if I speed it up, start getting different kinds of waveforms. So this is in you know, kind of a, particularly if they're close to each other in rate, sort of a pseudo-Lorenz thing, in the sense that it's kind of a repeating smooth wave, but it's a more complex than a basic pattern. So it's somewhere halfway in between a Lorenz and a straight up sine wave or a triangle wave. And then you can put further modulation on one of these. So if I change edit B, let's see, I want this to be, we'll go for religious, nope, we'll go for the Perlin noise, and we're going to slow this down. And go back to the A side modulation. I'm going to say source is LFO 3, and the destination is the rate of the second LFO, and I'm going to turn that down a bit. So now I've lined up 3 LFOs. So now there is some randomization added to the waveform, and it's going to constantly change. And different again from the cycles from a chaotic waveform, but an interesting way to explore unusual waveforms all in one module.
Yeah, particularly if you're doing generative patching and things like that, this is just a real gold mine for, it basically is a built, you know, self-contained generative CV source. It's wonderful.
Just a question from the chats, Jordan Justice, Double J. Any plans to allow combined LFO at the outputs, in brackets, mixing?
Yep, that's a possibility. I can't say exactly how that would appear, but it's one of the things I put on a list, things to fill in.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll go back to cover a few more details later on. And now I can't remember if Steve or Chris is next on the demo stage.
I'm going to demo a little bit, then Steve. Yeah.
Okay, Chris is next on the demo stage.
Awesome.
Yeah, I wanted to give some comparisons between the normal LFO shapes and the Lorenz and Perlin, and the different ways I use them musically, and what are the differences between them. So first I want to give an overview of the system. I'm driving an ARP 2600, going to be mainly driving the filter cutoff primarily for the experiments. I've got all 4 outputs from the QVL pre-patched over into the data, even though it's really nice that the QVL has this built-in oscilloscope display, and that's saved me many times. I'm just basically going to give you a larger display over here to see what's going on. And also, when you hear me playing notes down here, I've got a little key step to play. When I need to sustain a note, I'll be using a key dog on one of the keys to hold it down. So that's where the magical notes are coming from, including some arpeggios. So I didn't want to be too much of the wizard and what's behind the curtain. I just want to show you I'm driving. I even had a trigger out from the 2600 that we're going to be patching a little bit later on. But basically, we're going to be modulating filter and show you the different sounds of these different approaches. So let's zoom in here on what the QVL and data is doing. And we're pretty used to what a normal sine wave is, particularly if I set up a drone. You know, you have a sound coming in and out over time, and it's easy to change the rate for it to be very fast. Wobbly sounds or something very slow over a long period of time. And you can do that on drones, or you can set up arpeggios and have them evolve over time. And there's different waveforms. Sine's very common, but it does pause to the head and tail. If you go to something like a triangle, it's a little bit more of a constant velocity sound, maybe a little bit more even for some people. A lot of chorus units use triangle waves. And there's different waveforms in here. I particularly like this simulated attack decay wave. I think it has a very natural sound to it as well. And you have very slow modulations like this, or I, at a Moog Fest, saw Basic demonstrate his technique, and he likes to do very fast modulations with arpeggios so that each note has its own little inflection to it. And having that sort of repetitive modulation is really useful for a lot of forms of music, particularly more trance-based stuff, maybe floating stuff for ambient or new age, or for EDM and dance-based music where you're really trying to keep a driving beat going. However, my music's a little bit different. I'm a little bit more in the breakbeat, jazz sort of style. So I actually like to have constant variations happening in my music rather than being repetitive. My goal is to constantly have something for the listener to catch her ear. So that's why I like to move down to the other wave shapes, such as the Lorenz attractor and the Perlin noise. Now, the Lorenz attractor is basically, the example I use is imagine a moth flying around a light. A moth doesn't always stay the same distance around a light, which is something like a sine wave would do. Moths tend to go further away, then get closer to the light. They don't go so far away that they leave. They can't go through the light, so there's a band there within, but there's some randomness as to what's going on. And that's basically what Lorenz chaos type generator does, is it gives you LFO-like activity. I'll set up a drone here again. But unlike a sine wave, it has some variations to it. I typically find that actually the Lorenz attractor inside here is a little bit fast compared to like a normal sine wave. So what I'll do is I'll typically cut my Lorenz down to about half speed to get the same feel with the same number of like a sine wave or a triangle wave. I'll turn up the cutoff a little bit here. Now, the Lorenz attractor inside the QVL is what technically some people call a double well equation, or what Ian Fritz, the guy who's designed a lot of chaos modules, would call a 2I equation. And to show you that, I'm going to show you the multiple outputs you can get from one LFO inside the QVL. I'm going to go down to the output 1. That's fine, this LFO1's output. But for output 2, we're going to change it down to be a Y or Z dimension output from the same LFO. And you can see the waveform traces are similar but different. So that alone is pretty cool when you want to modulate multiple things like a wave folder and a cutoff. They will have slight variations even though they're controlled by the same master speed of LFO1. And to get an idea what that looks like, some people go to an XY plot where one LFO is on the X dimension, actually get back here, and the other LFO is on a Y dimension. We'll turn up this X scope. And now you can see basically our moth is going back and forth between two different light bulbs. It's spending some time around this light bulb, then jumps over to this light bulb over here. And you can control that path with the shape control on the QVL. I go all the way down. Our little theoretical moth is pretty happy spending its time just around this one light bulb down here. Some people refer to this as different eyes of this equation. But as I put more shape and more drive into this, occasionally the moth goes and checks out the other light bulb. So you have an LFO that's somewhat consistent, but then we'll throw in these variations every now and then. And the higher I increase shape, the more energized our moth gets. If I go all the way, the moth's going to spend a lot of time flying around the outside of both bulbs. And this clipping you're seeing here is just a display artifact inside the data. If you look at the green and blue waves, for the most part, they're staying within range. I can go ahead and cut down the range inside the QVL to stop that clipping at head or tail. But that's kind of the cool thing of Lorenz. It's a chaos function that's basically a sine wave with built-in variations. And if I set up an arpeggio again, it has that same up and down motion we were getting with our LFO before with a sine wave, but there's variations and it keeps changing, and I think it keeps the listener more engaged. And just for fun, we'll plug over into the Y output, the blue. So similar but different. I'm going to go ahead and turn our XY scope back off for now. Get that out of the display. And let's go ahead and turn LFO2's output, excuse me. to be back to being the normal sine wave for LFO1. So we can go ahead and compare those different outputs. So Lorenz is basically, it's a chaos function. You can think of it as a more interesting repetitive wave like a sine wave. What I really like is the addition of the Perlin noise, which gives you a much more fractal result. Rather than oscillating with variations, instead, like a true fractal, it has larger movements up and down, and I'll get the drone going again here. But it also has smaller details inside that larger motion. So even though it's tracing a path up and down here, there's little bumps happening inside of it. And I'll turn its speed back up. And here's a case where I actually like its speed a bit faster than normal LFO, just to hear better.
I can't help thinking, Chris, I can't help wondering what Alan Perlman would have thought about this combination of technology you got here. It's incredible.
Well, Perlin's equation was actually to help create fractal-like patterns like clouds, fire, and things like that inside 3D animation. That was his original goal. But the fact that we're getting these natural-like variations, I think, is really useful for music because we get something that's constantly changing. Again, here's just our straight sine wave LFO.
Yeah.
And I'll listen to that for so long until my brain gets bored and says, okay, I've got that figured out. What else do you have for me? Or if I'm listening to something like this, I find that I'm more likely to stay engaged and keep listening to it to hear where it's going to go next. As I increase the rate, you can see it gets up to the point where we get very noisy. And again, if I was to use that for an arpeggio instead of for a sustained note, and I'll go back and turn off the cutoff a little bit on this. So you have sometimes just the envelope hitting, other times the filter's wider open. And again, I can slow that down for very slow evolutions. And the very slow speeds, those people who have sloths in their racks or triple sloths, this gets you in that really slow evolution. And I can even change the range on this, if I remember right, to go even slower. Really slow variations for generative patches, for things that change over several minute piece. Or something's a bit crazy fast. Or gets more into basic type of territory.
And I think your point's great, Chris, about triple sloths, etc., because that's a module I have here in my rack as well. The QVL doesn't have to replace a bunch of stuff that's already in your rack, but you may well find that it can.
Yeah, in my case, I had a Studio Electronics STE16, which is a dual digital LFO with cross modulation.
Really nice LFO too, that one. Yep.
Replace that. I've got a Hypster and a triple sloth. Well, now that I've got both Perlin and Lorenz, I don't need those anymore because this can do it. Half of what I used Pamela's workout for was for timed sine waves, things like that follow. And that's something that could be your demo coming up next. And, it's replaced all those modules. And plus it has a sample and hold function as well. And I like to have sample and holds so I can have a variation on every single note that I trigger. Yeah. So that's why I have one of these on my performance rack and two of these inside my studio modular. And it's actually opened up room for more modules, which is all important.
Yeah.
And that's the main thing I wanted to show initially before we get a little bit later on and I show a really advanced patch of why I use different shapes and why I like these random shapes over it's just a normal sine wave and things like that. And I think, Steve, you had some musical applications you're going to show us as well, right?
I absolutely do. Yeah, absolutely do.
So let's move the spotlight over to Steve.
Yeah, let's just, Jim, if you could just march time for a second, I'll just get myself ready.
You are muted, I believe, Jim, or quiet.
I am muted.
There you go.
Muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'm just getting myself organized here. All right, so we should be flipping over. Oh, we have flipped over to my camera and it's a little bit askew. Let's get that organized. Anyone watching the 512 forum closely will have seen my masterful electric tape work during the week. So we're going to see the benefits of that today. All right, so thanks very much, Chris. I love that demo, and I love seeing people use the ARP 2600 like that too, because it's such a, you have those resources in your URAC, VCOs, VCFs, VCAs, all that stuff. It's just a great way to demonstrate more complex functions using a very straightforward interface. So yeah, I'm going to have to think about that myself. All right, so getting into this, what I'm going to do is start with a very simple pulsing rhythm from the vector sequencer, which is off the screen at the moment, which is, as I said, a bit of a strange thing. And I'm going to develop that into hopefully a little bit more of an interesting performance as I sort of move through the demo. I just want to show you the modules I'm using today. So obviously the 512 vector and QVL. I'm using a Mordax data. I'm using a tenderfoot quad quantizer. And also I'm using kind of the stars of my sound show at the moment, and the sound generating modules I go to the most these days. The Western Precision Audio phase animated oscillator, SF1 dual stereo filter, which Jim had in his case as well, and the SE1 shaped VC envelope, which is a brand new one from Devon at Western. I'm also using a Wong Vertex stereo VCA, going to a magneto delay for a bit later in the demo, because, delays are awesome. Okay,
never
so
have too much delay.
apparently not. Okay, no more of that. All right, so what I've got to start with is I've got an initialized preset on the QVL. Jim showed us how to do that earlier, so I'm not going to do it again. What I'm going to show you to start with is what the patch sounds like with nothing happening from the QVL. So I'm sending a series of gates from the vector with no pitch changing information in them. That'll be introduced later as we go. Da, 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 da. Right, so what I'm demonstrating there is that's all that the vector's doing. So you could use any trigger or gate sequencer to do what I'm about to do. It doesn't have to be the vector, but it could be. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is connect. I'm going to connect my Mordax outputs. And the reason I didn't do that sort of from the go is I wanted to show what stuff sounded like with no sort of pass-through modulation. I'm just turning off the things that I don't need over here. So what we've got on the Mordax is two traces. You can only see the one because they're both in sync completely, being two sine waves ascending, descending there. So what are we going to do next? We're going to clock the vector. Now I'm using a backplane connector from the vector to the QVL, and I'm going to clock the QVL from my vector sequencer. As I said, you could do this without a vector sequencer. You would just need to go in with a pulse or a clock via the gate input, gate 1 or 2 on the front panel of the QVL. So you can do all of this with or without the vector. It's just really easy and neat. Well, not that this is neat, but it's neat enough to do it with when you're using a backplane connector. So, let's go to clock. All I have to do is change that to vector, and it's already picked up the BPM from a vector. The really interesting thing about the QVL, or one of the really interesting things about the QVL, is that it's dual clocked. So side A can have one clock source, and side B can have a different clock source. So I have to always remember to go in and select a vector for both, if that's what I want. Now, if I hit run at the moment, nothing in particular is going to change, because I haven't synced any of the LFOs to the vector as yet. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm in LFO 1 right now. I'm going to leave it as a sine wave. I'm going to change the range to a musical division, and the musical division is going to be bar with a quantity of 1. And that means that each sine wave LFO cycle is going to go from the 0 point and ascend, descend, and back to 0 within the duration of a bar. And when I hit run and stop on the vector, if you're watching closely the green trace on the Mordax, or the trace you can see on the QVL, you'll see that it starts from the 0 point every time I hit run. Okay. Now, before I do hit run, that particular output is running into my quantizer. So what you're going to hear immediately is the same pulse from the trigger sequence on the vector with some new pitch information added by the QVL. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Stop, run. Stop, run. Stop, run. Now the reason I was doing that stop run thing is so you could see that the vector's starting the sequence, telling the QVL that the sequence is starting, and the QVL saying, fantastic, I'm now going to sync from your 0 point and start my wave from that point. So that just demonstrates how that works. Now, musically, is this any better than what I had before? No, it's not. I mean, there's some different pitch information in there, but it's pretty hokey. I think that's a word. Anyway, so what do we do about that? Well, we tame the melody. And there's a couple of points in this demonstration I'm going to be taming the melody because there's a lot we can do. So first up, I'm going to go to the output page for LFO1, and I'm going to reduce the level or the amplitude, and I'm going to change the offset. So the offset, somewhere around there, and actually let's show you in real time what that sounds like. So this is it with the full range. Okay, let's reduce the... So already we've got a somewhat usable pitch collection. So you've gone from something that has a whole lot of really low subnotes that don't sort of fit the melody up to some really high notes. It sounds like my cat when he runs across the piano in the middle of the night originally. Now it sounds like he's probably put a bit more time into his performance and he's hitting a similar collection of notes. So what's the problem, or one of the problems with this so far as a melody? Well, have a listen. I'm going to hit run and stop a few times. Run. Stop. Run. Stop, run. You probably get the picture. Because the sine wave is locked to the beat, to the bar rather. Because the sine wave is locked to the bar, every time it initiates from the 0 point, which is now offset by 18, it's the same curve every time. Therefore, the melody is going to be the same every time, which may or may not suit your purposes. And I kind of agree with Chris. There's a very quick point where my brain's going to go, no, I need some new information, please. And with melodies, that's particularly relevant. There's an old compositional thing, never to sort of do something more than 3 times, which sounds a bit silly, but often it's kind of true. It doesn't explain most of the post-punk I listen to, but that's a different topic for a different day. So let's add some interest to this, at least I hope we're going to, by doing some cross-modulation from LFO2 to cross-modulate LFO1. And that's the great thing about this module is I don't have to patch anything. It's got all of the routing matrix kind of on board. If you've done a lot of big sort of poly stuff with a decent mod matrix in it, you'll be right at home. And if you're not, you'll be at home real soon. So we're going to add the extra cross-modulation by going to LFO2. I'm going to change that. I'm going to leave it as a sine. I'm going to slow the rate right down to start with. We're going to play with that a bit later. And then what we're going to do is go through and actually set the source and destination. And this is running free, right? This is not synced to the vector. And the reason for that is we want to introduce change that's not predicted based on the bar lines. So we're leaving this as a wide range with the rate that I've already allocated. So I go through to my first mod matrix screen here. I just called it the mod matrix screen, but you can call it what you want. I'm going to set the destination as offset of LFO1, and I'm going to set the source. So I'm setting that now, nothing's happened. I'm going to set the source as LFO2. So now, again, we're getting a bit more varied pitch information, but we've introduced the same problem. We've introduced the problem that the pitch range has gone crazy again. Why is that, Steve? Glad you asked. It's because we haven't attenuated the amount. So all I need to do is just dial this back. Now what you've got is a sine wave, and if you look carefully on the Mordax, it's an uneven sine wave. And we can introduce more and more meandering by increasing the amount of modulation. So now let's stop the melody and start it again. Stop, start. Stop, start. What have we got now? Well, we've got an LFO1 running with cross modulation from LFO2 that's delivering a certain range, a meandering range of a sine wave, kind of a bit of a broken sine wave. But it's still within a pitch collection range that isn't introducing notes that are too high or too low or kind of ruining things. Because if you're making a melody sound or a melody instrument or a bass instrument or whatever kind of voice you want, you don't want to have to, when you're mixing it, have to account for, oh, there's this strange note that's a very different frequency to everything else. That can happen in generative music if you don't sort of plan ahead. So we've done the taming of the melody again. And as you can see on the trace here, that sine wave is sort of moving around in a meandering kind of way. So let's have a listen to something a little bit more we can do with that. So I'm going to hit run on the vector. And I'm going to go to my preset page on the vector, which is off screen. And I'm going to go to the correct part because I'm not on it. Preset page. Now I'm going to go to a more full preset that has 16th notes all the way through. So you can hear what the sine wave kind of sounds like without the rests in it. It's kind of a more is more performance. That's the SF1 cutoff I'm playing with there. It's delightful. I think Devon might be on the chat actually, but beautiful filter, mate, if you're there. So you can hear there with the 16th running a bit more clearly what's happening with that modulated sine wave. Now I'm just going to go to another. Right. That's the preset rhythm we're going to do the rest of the demo with. Okay. Moving right along. Well, how can we make that a little bit more interesting? Or at least more dense, because that's always better. I'm going to plug in my third trace here from the QVL, and I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping and bring that up. All right, that one's on. That one's off. Yeah. That one's off as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is modulate from LFO3 to my Strymon Magneto. Still love that thing. And what I'm going to do is modulate from the QVL. I'm going to modulate the wet amounts on the delay module, on the Magneto. And what that's going to do then is introduce extra layering to this melody. And because there are different pitches being played through it, it kind of adds a really pleasing sound to it. Well, I think so. I'll let you guys be the judge of that. But only comment if you like it, of course, because I'm fairly fragile. Okay, so moving right along, LFO3. Main page, I go to LFO3, and what do my notes tell me? They tell me LFO3, sample and hold. Yeah, okay. This is cool. I love sample and hold. I've had a few different modules that do sample and hold to varying degrees. One of them I really like is the ADAC dual sample and hold. It's a very nice module. I haven't used it for a long time though, even though it's a very nice module. And that's because the QVL here does the things I need it to as well. So what I've got running right now is sample and hold. I've reduced the shape to 0 so that it's right angles on the sample and hold shape. I'm going to set it up with the musical division, and this time it's going to be 16ths, and I'm going to set it to, let me think, 4 to start with. So that means that when the vector's running, a sample and hold instance will occur every 4 16th notes. And the source at the moment is set to random. So there's a random generator within the QVL that is being processed via the sample and hold process. Oh, I use process in the same sentence twice. Anyway, the source could be many, many things. It could be another LFO. It could be an envelope gateway. And it can even be CV from external. So if you have another LFO device or another CV source that you want to sample from, you can do that too. So this is more than just an LFO. It's a complete modulation utility in a lot of ways. Wow, there's a tagline. Someone should write that down. So anyway, let's bring that in. So you can see on the red trace where the sample hold's landing, and you can hear the Strymon either doing a wet signal or not. Now at the moment, there's a couple of things that I don't like about it. One of the things I don't like about it is that the range, again, needs to be tamed, because it's either a lot or none, and it's kind of jarring when you do it that way. So let me just tame that a little bit. I'm going to go to the all-important output page, and I'm going to change the offset to 12. Oh, amazing. I dialed it and it went straight there. Yay me. And I'm going to reduce the level to 43. Now when I hit run, it's going to sound a little bit better, and then there'll be one other change I make. Okay. So that's better already because it's not as jarring, and the sample and hold level that's modulating the Strymon is then producing different volume or density, or volume rather, of the wet signal. So it's not just either loud or not, it's a little bit on, more on, not on, which I think is more pleasing. The one thing that is still crap about this though, which I'm going to fix, is the right angles. It doesn't sound like someone sitting on the module turning a knob when it's right angles of modulation, as is common with this square sort of shaped sample and hold. What do we do about it, Steve? We dial shape. And if you watch the trace on the QVL or the trace on the data, the Mordex data, you'll see now we've got some more wiggly sounding, or looking, shaping. So it's still a sample and hold from the random source, but we've rounded the edges. And now that sounds like... It sounds a bit like someone's sitting on the wet control on the Strymon and is actually turning it rather than it just being right angle changes. So I like that a lot more. The one last thing I'm going to do is, for bonus points in the bonus round, is modulate resonance on the SF1. So I'm going to just plug that one in. I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to get this one turned on. So what we see now is a sine wave from LFO4 on the QVL, and I'm going to go to LFO4. I'm going to change it to triangle, and I'm using all the basic waveforms here, which is a little bit different to what Jim and Chris had talked about. I'm a basic sort of guy. So here we are. We've got triangle. I'm going to change it to... What do I want? I probably want 1/16 for this one as a musical division, and I'm going to give it a 1. So every 16th that triangle wave is gonna complete, and it is going to modulate the cutoff on the Western Precision Audio SF1 dual stereo filter. Sorry, it's going to modulate the resonance, not the cutoff. Now, the other thing that I'm going to do is just hit run, I think, and it will do it. So that resonance is really chirpy now because every 16th the cycle of the wave LFO is completing. So let's... All right, it's working. But what else can we do with it to make it a little bit more fun? We're going to change the shape again. Watch carefully. And that gives it a nice kind of pinpointed sweep on the resonance, and keeping in mind the point that that Jim made before, because the resonance on this particular filter doesn't have attenuation, etc. on it, that's fine. We just all do it from the LFO source, and it's the best of both worlds in a lot of ways. So if we reduce the rate back to 1, we could also go in and start playing around with that. But the great thing about an LFO in this situation is if you set up your rates differently to each other, you kind of get a polyrhythmic sound because you've got a delay running and it's jumping in and out at various points. And you've also got this little resonance thing, which when it chirps away, it enters the delay trails as well and creates a little bit of an offsetting rhythm. So look, I just wanted to demonstrate what is a fairly simple patch, I guess, using quantization and a couple of other things to create interest on what started from my gate or trigger sequencer being the vector as just da-da, whatever, just over and over again. The pitch information is all being introduced from the QVL. It's being then quantized to notes by the tenderfoot QQ4, I think it's called, and so on. But yeah, that is my demo.
I think it was really nice to show how you can, add these generative qualities to something where it's constantly changing over time. And when you're doing your demo, I was reminded of an interview that Brian Eno gave where he said, the problem a lot of people have with generative music is that it never returns back to a main theme. It doesn't recapitulate back to something. He thinks that's why people lose interest in generative. And the fact that the QVL has all these reset inputs on it means that you can change a preset on the vector, have one of the parts send a reset signal out, patch that up to an input on the QVL, reset, and that'd be a way of recapitulating a theme while still having a generative patch. And it's just great to have all those capabilities in there. Because the same thing when I was playing around with stuff like the Lorenz attractor, I like Lorenz because it's a sine wave, but with variations. So you're not too far off into crazy land and people don't lose interest. I think it's the same thing with generative. The ability to say, now let's reset and we're back to where we were before. You've heard this theme before is a really nice combination.
I completely agree with you, Chris, and I think I don't mind having something reference to Brian Eno. That's fantastic because my approach to this is, of course, from a guitar perspective, which was my main instrument for many years, was improvisation. And improvisation isn't just about hitting every note on the fretboard. It's about finding out which key you're in, which notes you can use in that key that you want to actually emphasize, and then sort of playing with them and maybe not doing the same thing every time. And I think for me, generative music I like having that subtle control in it. Of course, you don't have to. You can just let it free range and do what you like. But yeah, for melody generation and so on, I prefer to have a little bit more sort of shaping and contouring and a concept around it.
Mm-hmm. And That's the funny thing when we've been talking about like chaos. A lot of people think chaos means total insanity, but the actual chaos theory is you're within boundaries. So you're not going completely crazy. You're within a range, but inside that range, you can be unpredictable. And that's why I like to introduce that in my music.
Brilliant. Excellent. Well, thanks for the feedback there, Chris. Great.
Great demo, Steve. I kept wanting to interject comments, but you just nailed it.
This is what happens when I'm half asleep and I don't think about it too much. If I think about it too much, yeah, it's a whole other thing. Yeah.
All right. Are we ready for our musical interlude?
Yeah, we can move on to that. You want to bring up the patch and I can talk a little bit about what was done on the modular and otherwise, and then we'll play back the piece?
Sure. Let me bring up the image.
So the piece that Jim's going to be playing is just something I've finished recently. And for me, it was an unusual piece in several regards. It was short. It was 7 minutes. Normally, I play for 20 or 30 minutes. It actually has a verse-chorus structure, which is kind of unusual in a lot of electronic music these days. And I multi-tracked it. I did this multiple passes, and you'll see that during the playback where I actually show you the Ableton Live screen of when different parts come in and out. And it was a hybrid piece where several voices were done on the modular system, and this was the patch during that piece. And then a few polysynths were used as well. And in the order that they will appear during the music, the voices, Apollo 13 communications, were actually processed through the Instro Arbhar, and it was triggered actually by Mutable Instruments grids. I should talk a little bit about timing, as I do run a hybrid system where Ableton Live is the leader in my system, but I send MIDI clock to the vector sequencer inside the modular. It's kind of in the lower left there, a little bit behind the mixer interface. And I have the vector expander, which is really important to me because it gives me all these different outputs that I can set to different clock divisions. So I can send one clock division off to the DDL delay and say, hey, I want you to be a really slow delay. I can send it off to marbles and say, I need you to be a little faster pace for your part. I can send it off to grids. I usually use 16th notes to generate drum-like patterns. I have grids then send those drum-like patterns back into the vector. So the vector and its jack expander has really worked as a real clocking center for me to clock things at different rates. And for this piece, I was using the vector to clock marbles, to clock grids, creating a pattern so triggers would happen on beats, but then I was using a probability skipper so that only a few of those got through to Arbhar to trigger its voices. That's why the voices tend to come in on musical intervals like beats, is because there's actually a grid underneath it that I'm poking holes in that grid using the probability skipper. For the pluck strings, I've got a pair of rings. I've got an original gangster rings from Mutable, and then a micro ring, so micro rinks up there as well. And what I was doing is I was taking a part out of the vector and sending it into an IntelliGel Shifty to alternate back and forth between playing one rings, then the other rings, sort of a hocketing pattern. And what that gave me was the ability to set up the two rings to different timbres. So I had two different pluck sounds trading off against each other. And I could have a lot more fun with the stereo field of them as well, having two different hard right and left pans. So I could go ahead and put my stereo field. And I used a lot of chance operations inside the vector to play around with the basic underlying pattern. I started with just the downbeat sounding and the other notes all muted, then decreased the probability that those notes would be muted to let them start popping in and filling out the pattern until they fill out the pattern. Then later on in the piece, I use chance operations inside the vector to go ahead and do occasional octave transpositions of some notes. I was also doing some manual octave transpositions for a little piece of software called Calibrator, just sitting before the rings. And I was also using it to do ratcheting every now and then. And since those notes were hocketed between two different rings, you got some really nice effects. But then I was also using things like the QVL to modulate parameters of rings, to really modulate the position and the brightness in particular. And I was using the smooth things like Perlin and Lorenz, particularly Lorenz for this patch, so that the sound could change during the duration of note. Particularly if you modulate the position parameter on rings during a note, you hear this phase shifting sound going on. So that's the case where I would use a smooth random, such as the Perlin or the Lorenz inside the QVL. The next voice that comes in from the modular during the piece is actually a bass line, which has three different oscillators layered together. But again, I'm using a combination of the vector and its chance operations and the QVL to do things such as change the length of the notes and then how strong the envelope was hitting the filter. I had the envelope generator going through a VCA into the filter cutoff, and then I had a randoms function. You could use sample and hold. You could also use vectors velocity with randomization turned up to change how deep the envelope's modulation was on the filter for every individual hit, and also use the sample and hold function to vary the decay on individual notes. So each of the notes have a little different articulation to them, because I want to get the impression of someone hunched over their Fender bass plucking it rather than just a normal repetitive 8th note or 16th note bass line. There's some other melodic instruments in there. For example, an Osmos is the drone at the very beginning. Prophet VS does a little vocal ahs that come in during the piece. The very slow leads are paid on the iridium. And then towards the end, where there's these really loud wah modulations going on, that's actually the qubit scanned that's at the top of the case slightly to the right, which has this really weird evolving sound all by itself. But they were still a little too repetitive every single note. So I then patched that through an additional filter and used a combination of the Perlin noise and some additional tricks to create what I call a chaotic envelope. And that's a patch I'm going to demonstrate using the QVL after we're done with the piece. But anyway, I want to give you the lay of the land of what are the different voices coming out of the modular system. And you'll actually get to see now in the live interface how the different parts come in and out. So Jim, if you want to switch to the video and you can play that now, that'd be cool.
All right, doing the switch over.
I didn't want to speak because it just that moment of the music drifting away is just so rewarding. That was really beautiful, Chris.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
An engaging piece of music. Forget about it being modular. Forget about all the mess of things. It's simply a good piece of music. So,
well, I'm really trying to make the modular sound more human and more like human beings are playing the parts rather than necessarily being a very regimented type of sequence. Excuse me while I have one of my lights on. I'll get in the way of the light here. And particularly like the bass line, it was actually the notes are inside the vector sequencer with some chance operations to do some occasional transpositions, but it's being driven by the timing of grids and a kick drum pattern out of grids. And I'm manually writing the fill of how busy the kick pattern is. So I go ahead and make a busy bass line, pull it back out again and things like that during the performance. Just tricks like that, just trying to make things a bit more human and I hope more engaging.
So you've got grids, one of the trigger outputs going into one of the trigger inputs on your expander by the sound of things, and you're using that as the gates progression for the vector to then pump out the stuff, which is basically what you just said. Yeah, I was just working it out in my head. No, that's fantastic. Yeah. I've done that before with grids and with Euclidean circles and things like that too. It's a really good function. But yeah, that was lovely. So tell us a bit about the modulation paths you had sort of set up there.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I was using a variety of different modulations. For the different rings parts, I was using a lot of random smooth modulations to constantly be changing the position in rings, which is like, are you picking closer to the bridge or closer to the middle? Yeah, but the fact that it was modulating during the course of a note created this interesting phase shifting sound rather than it just being a clean note coming out all the time. And then also had another random source controlling the brightness of the notes. That's why some bright notes just seem to really ping out and hit the echoes and really go through the echoes, while the ones are more muted. That's because I get a different random sources changing what's happening there. But for the bass line, I went for what are called stepped random sample and hold functions to instead say, let's decide how hard we're hitting the filter. Let's decide how long the decays are on individual notes, in addition to playing around with the timing of the notes themselves.
It's funny because when the piece started, I thought, oh, this is weird. Chris is using a guitar sample loop. And then I realized, oh, it's not a loop. Oh, it's rings. So it fooled me.
That's why I wanted to show the Ableton Live patches. I wanted to show what was behind the curtain, and that was the idea with the Ableton Live patch, just showing what the parts are, but also even where the edits are and things like that.
Yeah.
You know, I do play the pieces through, but I didn't try to say, that would have been better. That's the problem with random stuff. Sometimes they hit their highs at the wrong time musically during the piece. And you can manually ride an attenuator to decide at least how much is going to try to come through. But sometimes you go back and edit and say, this has been better in this measure instead of this measure.
Yeah, I do that too. And I mean, I think it's entirely a great way of arranging a piece of music. But it sounded to me like two guys out on a desert rock concert stage somewhere, sort of standing, looking at each other, past the drum, I'm going to pick you up. It was great. So I very much enjoyed that. And I think it's the maturity of the way that you can apply the modulation in the right amounts with the right amount of color. I think when we sort of start in Eurorack or start with synthesis, I mean, it's great just getting those huge sweeps going on and so on. But what a sound design thing goes, whether it's your Eurorack or like it's this big blue monster behind me, being able to sort of add in subtle modulation on things really keeps that interest going. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think managing levels and attenuating stuff is like one of the secrets of mastering a modular system. And that's why in the QVL, it's so nice to have the levels and offset built right in there. So if the module in particular doesn't have it, and a lot of modules don't have input attenuators for their different parameters, it's nice to be able to get more subtle with a QVL and just dial in, this is how much I want this to stick out right here.
Yeah. Excellent. No, I loved it. Loved it.
So in the last verse of the piece, there is an occasional punctuation of sound going wah, and that's actually the qubit scanned module, which is based on an algorithm that Max Matthews came up with, but I don't think he ever actually had a chance to implement it. And the idea was if you had a bunch of strings and then you started connecting the strings together, and if you started attaching weights to the strings, what would that sound like? And Qubit took it upon themselves to try to build a module doing that. And it's an extremely difficult module to tame, I'll tell you that. It's But occasionally you get these amazing sounds where you hit it with a trigger and you get this stuff building out of it. But again, unless I was modulating the depth out of it, every one of those would have been exactly the same. And I like to have every hit, particularly if I'm doing a very slow bass note or something like that, every one to be articulated a little bit different than each other. So I've been playing around with different ways of enveloping filters to add more life and more variation for each individual hit of a particular sound, such as that scan sound. And at this point, I'd like to switch over and actually demonstrate that on the 2600 I have here and show what I used to use and now how I'm using the QVL. So I'm going to punch over my video and hopefully...
I think there's an angel appearing behind you, Chris. You better watch out,
Yep.
mate.
It's the
I've had this before where...
Don't go to
Yeah, I can't go to the Black Magic, so you have to do the infamous pull the power. Plug it back in. And I know what else is going to go wrong here, but now we should.
Hey, your audio is a lot cleaner, by the way, now too. You're speaking, etc. So whatever you
I put a really heavy downward expander on it, and I think now that I've rebooted my ATEM, I have to check one more thing. Oh, good, that's bright. That's good. Okay. So I'm going to show some of the stuff I was doing, particularly to modulate the scanned in this piece, but I've used it for other pieces. Hello. Sometimes you just can't win. Okay, we'll go with this way. In the past, I've used the Zadar to create more interesting envelopes. It has a few sounds or shapes like this with multiple bumps during the decay of it. So I'm going ahead and take a trigger out of the 2600, go into a trigger in on the Zadar. I'm going to take what was my modulation output coming previously out of the QVL, and we'll get back to it. And right now, take it out A of the Zadar. And I've got this depth to the filter turn up all the way right now. So if I hit a note, you can hear how it changes during the life of a note. It has a little bit of a bump to it rather than being just a steady decay into silence. I can pull the filter down a little bit here. But again, this is going to be the same on every note unless you really get into modulating and setting up patches inside the Zadar to change the shape. And you can kind of bend that shape around, but it's not the same thing as having something different on every single note. So I came up with something called the chaotic envelope, where I'm using some of these chaos waves, like we've been playing around with in the QVL, and bent that into an envelope shape that I can then modulate something with the filter. So I'm going to go ahead and get the QVL woken up again. I'm going to go into one of the gate inputs on the QVL. Actually, I'll go up into gate 1 up here. And I'm going to start by looking at its third output down here, which is this magenta trace. And right now it's defaulting to a sine wave. But as Jim touched on briefly, there's a pair of envelope generators inside the QVL. And you can use that to modulate other things happening inside or come directly as an output. And the default use for things like that would be like to have a delayed vibrato come in or have the speed of a vibrato change over time, as if you hit the switch on the Leslie to change the speed of a Leslie. But you can use it as an envelope to shape the amplitude of random functions as well. So let's go down to Edit B and set the output of 3 not to be LFO 3, but instead to be envelope 2. And then I'm going to go a little further down in here and say, we'll come back to that. Back up here. There we go. What are called the resets, it basically are the trigger inputs. And for EG2, I'm going to say, let's look at the trigger and gate input, number 1, which I have coming here. Here's my envelope. It's an attack release envelope. I'm going to knock the attack time down to 0, give it a little bit longer of a release time. And now when I hit a note on my little key step keyboard down here, you see how it's a very simple ramp envelope. So it's nice having spare envelopes in here to begin with, but I'm going to use this to modulate the level of one of our chaos sources. So I'm going to move my output over to number 4 from the QVL. I'm going to back up here and look at what my output 4 is. It's the LFO 4, which is what I want. And the wave shape, I'm going to switch over to being Perlin noise and set up a pace for it where I'm kind of happy with its range here. So let's go ahead and get a little more output here. Let me turn on number 4 here so you can see the output on the data. So there's this random, some people call it drunken walk. I like to call it fractal output from the Perlin noise. And if I was just to hold down a note, you'd get this random modulation. I'm going to turn up the cutoff a little bit. So that keeps on going on its own, but I want to actually shape that so it attacks and decays for every single note. So I'll go into the modulation pages on the QVL, edit B, go down to one of the cross mods, say the source is going to be envelope 1. Actually, envelope 2 is what I was using. Destination is going to be the level for LFO 4, and we're going to control it completely. I'm going to back up here and just turn 4's own level all the way down to 0. So nothing coming out with the Perlin noise on 4 until I hit a note. And we get the random effect. But then the magenta envelope from the QVL is fading it back down to no effect. So I'm going to turn down my cutoff a little bit here. New note. Another note. Articulate it differently. Another note. And every new note I hit is going to be articulated differently, but that random wobbling is going to fade out as if I had a normal slow decay on my filter cutoff. Now that by itself is a little hard to control. It doesn't really have the attack of a normal envelope. So I'm going to go back down to the 2600 and turn up its own envelope amount and mix the 2600's envelope in with the QVL's output. I could also take the envelope output directly out of the QVL as well and run that into the 2600. So I'm going to have my little spit attack on every note from the 2600's envelope, but then it's going to be overlaid with this chaotic envelope. So particularly these big drawn out bass notes. And I really like doing that for these really slow bass lines that you only trigger like once every 1 or 2 measures. So that every time I hit it, it's going to have a different character to it. And creating this chaotic envelope patch used to take up several modules inside my system. And I'm really happy now that I can do so much of it directly inside the QVL, and I can save it as a preset. So I don't have to go patch it up again from scratch. So that's why I've added a second QVL to my system. I've put the second QVL over where all my envelope generators are. And I'm going to save some presets of chaotic envelopes over there. So I have them immediately to recall without having to patch and take up a bunch of other modules. And then my first QVL, I'm still going to be using for different random sources and stuff like that. So that's another use for QVL for doing something kind of more complex of a patch. And that's a nice thing of having multiple things, 4 LFOs, 2 envelopes inside this one box, and this cross modulation and the additional shaping of the outputs. It's just been really handy. Hear the modulation fade out there. So that's why I have 3 QVLs already.
A very nice summary. Nice. Very good.
Now let me go back to this. Hi, everyone.
Excellent.
So about an hour. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just a general question. With 2 QVL modules, is it possible to link both to the vector and sync both?
Yes, once I make the appropriate cables. I've got cables and connectors over there, and Chris has requested a custom, and I'll be putting some up on the store. We'll have one. It'll probably be 3 drops with somewhere between 18 to 24 inches between each drop.
Yeah, in my case, the monster is a meter, over 3 feet across, and I've got QVLs at different extremes of it in the vector down here. So I need a short drop and a long drop, and we're going to be making sure that it communicates over a distance. I'm pretty excited about having both of them synced up.
So the answer is yes. You just need to order the correct cables to do so. In the box, the QVL comes with a single cable to connect to your vector sequencer. If you need to connect more than one QVL, and really, who doesn't? Then yeah, you'd want to get that extra cable. Brilliant.
Or if you've got a ribbon cable maker kit, you can make your own as well.
Yeah.
Warranty be voided.
It's just standard. It's just standard ribbon cable, and if you know how to make power cables, you can use those same adapters. Just be certain to not feed it power, or then we'll just have to have a talk. Yeah. No. Now that we've got more things running and people are buying more modules, we need to make sure we've got some options for people to link them all up together.
Yeah, for sure. Brilliant.
All right. So for our final demo, I'll see if I can recreate my Krellish patch. Let's switch over to my demo system, and let me get sound back on for it.
Do you want to just describe the origin of the Krell patch, Jim, or you want me to do that while you're patching up, or?
Chris, why don't you do that, because you know it better than I do, and mine is kind of a variation on it.
Yeah. So one of the heroes of the electronic music scene are the Liberans. They did soundtracks for early movies like Forbidden Planet, and they actually hardwired many different chaotic modules that they used to drive some really primitive oscillators and amplifiers back then to create the real sci-fi sounds. And for one of the movies, they had to do what was called the music of the ancient Krell. What would a completely alien symphony or music form sound like? And what happened was they basically patched something that had random notes and random durations for each of the notes as well. And Todd Barton, who's an expert, particularly at Buchla systems, as well as Surge and other ones, has been a real person at the forefront showing how to create the Krell patch on modern modular systems. And it usually involves various random control voltage generators in addition to envelopes where you can change your release times and things like that to create this randomized pitch and randomized length of each individual note. And Jim took it upon himself to say, could you do a Krell patch essentially inside the QVL? Because previously these things consumed a lot of modules to make it happen. And this is his, I think this is your first pass, more or less, isn't it, Jim? I mean, I was already impressed how far along it was.
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple of tricks I'd want to add to have the full flavor of it, but I've been pretty pleased with the results from just this initial pass, and also the performability of it. Being able to set up the QVL so that you can take it in different directions from the main control panel.
I think some feature ideas have already kind of shaken out of doing this patch. And that's the nice thing for people who don't know. Jim plays underneath the name Meridian Alpha, so he regularly composes and performs music as well. And I think that really helps inform design of modules. It's always good to see a designer who actually makes music as well.
Yeah, nothing like performance panic to get you to add the feature you've been waiting for.
Brilliant. Sorry,
so
before you get started, sorry, Jim, just before you get started, sorry, I'm just responding to a couple of really good what do you call it, queries here. So the first one was from Mark. Going back a bit, I don't see RMod 1 as an option in my mod submenu. I'm not sure what that one
that
means.
is that I'm working. That's the ring mod option on the QVL. So if I show it on my screen,
sorry,
it's a modulation target.
What version of firmware was that introduced into?
This one is not public yet. Chris, I think you have it because.
Okay.
So a little background. Most modulation combinations from a source to destination, adding in the signal, it makes the most sense. But in some cases, particularly when you have two sine waves modulating each other's levels, it's more useful to have multiply. And so initially, the level destination was multiplied just because I was getting more interesting results, and then it quickly becomes a problem because then you can't use envelopes properly and so forth. So now there's level modulation and ring mod modulation, because ring mod is, at least on the mathematical side of things, multiplication.
Right. Yeah.
And
I wasn't.
Sorry. Yeah. And to answer the other question in terms of getting vector and QVLs to sync, the current QVL build that's out, there's an update for it because there's a slightly different pin assignment on the earlier vectors versus the newer ones in terms of sending clock, and that's a straightforward internal fix, and I'll get the updated build out in the next few days.
And it's super reliable. You won't even know that it was ever a problem once you get it in. Luckily, I have a serial number 83 vector, so we're able to in the real world, in the field, sort of test those things too. So the fix does work, Mark. Just Jim, as he said, is going to get something up there. If you don't see anything, just reach out to him or myself. Cool. Sorry about that. I just wanted to answer the chat questions while they come up.
That's what we're here for, is to answer questions, and we'll do more right at the end as well.
Yeah.
All right. So on the Krell patch, as Todd Barton has built it, a lot of the timing comes from modulation on the attack and the release phase of a looping attack release envelope. And I have that on here, but I don't have an end of cycle on that envelope yet. So I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to go to LFO 2, and I'm going to set it to be a square wave with a very, very short duty cycle. And that's going to be, in a sense, my internal clock. And then I will add variation by modulating this clock. But first, let me get sound going everywhere. Okay, so I've got the Osiris is my sound source, and I'm running it into my laptop, running a copy of Valhalla Room for reverb, and basically all that, and I'm using the built-in low-pass gate style envelope on the Osiris. LFO 2 is kind of my gate trigger source. It's coming out of output 2, and I'm using a splitter. I'm sending one output of the splitter into the trig input on the Osiris, and the other output is coming back into the gate 1 input, which I'll use later to trigger sample and hold. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go back, and I'm going to change LFO 3 to be a Lorenz attractor, because this is going to be one of my semi-random sources. And I'm just going to leave that with default values. And then I'm going to go to LFO 4, and I'm going to change that to be the Perlin noise, which is where I'm going to get my randomizations from. I'll speed that up a little bit. And let me just check my cheat sheet photos real quick. Alright, so I'm going to go back to LFO 2. I'm going to modulation. I'm going to use LFO 4 as the source, so that's my random waveform, and I'm going to change the rate of basically my clock / gate, and I have the rate amount, so I can leave that fairly high. Manually adjust the filter for a minute so you can hear things more clearly. So now I have my random patterns. Now I want to add some pitch control. I'm going to change LFO 1 to be a sample and hold. I skipped it. There we are. The source is basically what it's sampling, and we're going to change it to be LFO 3, which is the Lorenz attractor. And range and rate means it's using an internal clock to resample. We're going to change the mode to be external, and now our trig is going to be gate 1. patching real quick. Yep. Okay, so now I want to add a little bit of a timbral variation. I've got a patch cord coming out of CV4, and that is the Perlin noise generator. I'm going to patch that back into filter cutoff. Bring the cutoff down. Bring the attenuator up a bit on it. And similarly on the decay front, I'm going to take output 3, which is a Lorenz attractor. Patch that directly into the decay CV input of the Osiris. Okay, I want to do some attenuation on there. One other thing I remember about the Osiris is that pitch is only from 0 to I think 5 volts or higher. Chris would know, but I believe it doesn't respond to negative voltages for pitch.
I can confirm it. Voltages for pitch, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the output at 1, and I'm going to change that to be scaled 0 to 5 volts. So now we're not banging against the bottom of the CV range all the time. So I still have some controls I can use to make this more performable. We already have rate of the square wave. That makes things faster or more sparse. Another thing that's useful is I go down to the customization page. Instead of the rate of 1, which is no longer useful because that's a sample and hold wave, I want to have amount 1, which is the amount of modulation. It's this value here. How much is LFO4 modulating the rate of LFO2? Another way to kind of fine-tune things. And of course, on the other side, I have rates for both the Lorenz attractor and the Perlin noise generator. So, I mean, clearly more options available in terms of customizing the parameter ranges, exploring different parameters. Instead of just using the Lorenz attractor, I could use modulated sine wave. For example, I could use a sine wave modulated by the Perlin noise. Possibly even building some sort of feedback by taking the sample and hold output and using that to modulate something else.
I think it's a good demonstration of what the QVL can do. I've talked to some people who said, well, it's 4 LFOs. So what? I have LFOs. You don't have this and all this cross modulation and what it can do and the random functions, etc.
Yeah, it's it's kind of a little mini CV modular in itself, right? You've got 4 LFOs with a variety of waveforms. You've got a couple envelope generators and the matrix for connecting those items, and a lot of flexibility on the output side. And as you said, you can store it in preset and save yourself some extra modules. My main case is always small enough that I can travel with it, and so being able to have those extra utility functions built in, saves a few HP for other things.
And this is not the end of its features either, because you're continuously adding to it at this phase of its development.
Yes, there's more coming. The backplane has a fairly high-speed data connection that I'm fine-tuning, and we'll cover that in another video. But the idea is that all of the CV inputs and the LFOs and the gate information and so forth will be fed back to the vector, which all become modulation sources. And similarly, the backplane will be a MIDI output option for the vector. And so at a minimum, you'll be able to use program changes to change presets, but you can also use MIDI notes and CC values to change other things on the QVL. There'll be modulation sources. And there's a lot of exploration available with other types of chaotic waveforms. Even with the Lorenz, for example, it doesn't really have any notion of phase because it never really repeats, but it does seem to go through recognizable visual cycles. So I could set phase as a way to identify some of those cycles and make it easy to just kind of, again, fine-tune, dial in a certain area of its behavior more easily. So we have a couple questions on the chat. ETA of the next firmware with the advanced sample and hold. I'm going to say next week. We're kind of tweaking a few things for this demo, but now that everything's running in that sense, I can polish it off and we can run a few tests on it and get it out. There'll be a companion vector upgrade as well to handle sync on older units and just to make sure the two are communicating with each other properly. Internal quantization, stepped octaves. I can't say for sure. It's something we want to look into. Chris, this is a good one for you. Sorry I was late to the vid tonight. Are there any similarities / crossover with something like the Rossum control forge?
The Rossum control forge is basically the envelope out of a Morpheus. So the control forge is like an extremely complex multi-segment envelope, but it doesn't really, it has a lot of CV capabilities, so I don't want to sell it short. It's a hell of a module. It's kind of almost like a Buchla Marf multiple arbitrary function generator by comparison. But it's more of a complex envelope than necessarily a plethora of modulation sources, including ones that can interact with each other. So I find that the QVL is not, a modulation source. It's several modulation sources and ones that can interact with each other. And that's how I kind of treat it in my case. And I know these days, I have the big monster in the studio, but, I travel as well. And size is important in a lot of people's systems. And be able to have 4 of something with all this internal capabilities and presets in a small form factor, has been really valuable for me.
Okay, next question. We have backplane preset changes with 2 or more QVL modules or preset changes sent as a singular message, or could you send different preset changes to different modules? I don't know yet. We're still figuring that out. There's kind of a balance between offering flexibility and keeping it straightforward enough that people can use it. And just in terms of sending preset changes, I've had some internal turmoil about how how tightly coupled that should be to, say, any one part or project or so forth. But for now, what I'm going with is the idea that the backplane will become a MIDI. It's like a MIDI cable from the vector to all the modules, and you'll be able to send one or more parts to the backplane, like it's a MIDI cable. And in terms of distinguishing messages for different QVLs, it seems like using MIDI channel numbers are the way to do that. So I guess the answer to that question then would be that what you can do is you can send two parts out the backplane together, and then use different MIDI channels, which are included with the program change message. And then that way you could say your first QVL listens to channel 1 and your second QVL listens to channel 2. But also I would recommend, in terms of general sanity, is that if you're preparing a live set, to organize the presets you're going to use into a single bank, and kind of order them in the way that you'll use them, so that you kind of have that all easy to find when you're setting up for a gig and everybody's driving you crazy and you're trying to get your stuff together and you can't figure out why the right preset's not loading. Is if you follow a fairly strict organizational routine, it'll make it easier. Right, Steve?
Yeah, I agree with that completely. So I was just responding to something. But yeah, definitely right. Yeah.
So yeah, no, I mean there are a lot of really interesting things that are going to start happening with the backplane, and basically I've been figuring out kind of the higher level protocol. How often messages go out, how big are the messages, how that fits with the event scheduler on the vector already, and not quite ready to show it, but it's going to be very interesting. In a way, the QVL becomes both a CV expander and a CV output expander and a CV input expander. So, okay, any further questions or comments? There will be more along this stuff. I've been promising myself to do a couple of tutorial videos just based on the demos I gave here. And those of you that are learning modular patrons will have Chris has done a demo for them as well. Of course, this video will be up for, and I don't know, I think it takes about a half hour for them to crunch it up and get it posted.
Oh, I think we covered a lot of ground.
We did.
Yeah,
we did.
We really did.
How to spend 3 hours on an LFO?
Yeah, that's right. Well,
we're only at 2, but yeah.
That's true. 2 hours.
A lot of good information. Maybe should have put this up at the beginning, but the deep dives are the sort of things you can just kind of dip into for a few minutes and then come back later. I should also mention before we completely tune off.
We should have set up an LFO for 2 hours and then scheduled our conversations to sort of come off the LFO cycle. All right.
So, and last little tidbit is they are on sale at the 512 web shop. So I'll keep the sale up through the weekend. I guess I'll say sometime when I get up on Monday and make coffee, they'll be back to the regular prices. We have a fair number of both in stock right now.
Brilliant. So that's ordered through yourself, Jim. Is that what you're saying there?
Yeah, that's through my web shop on Square. It's 512inc.square.site. If you go to the 512 webpage, there's a link there for it. And,
brilliant. And a bit of a social question. C3 is asking, who's going to be at NAMM?
I will not be at NAMM. I'm working on some top secret doodads.
Doodads are good things to work on. I didn't think I was going to make it, but I'll be at NAMM, and actually there is a panel on modular synthesis Thursday at 11 o'clock on the second floor of the Hilton that I will be at, and I'll be one of the panelists for that, along with a couple other people. So yeah, we'll be at NAMM, and I guess there's an alternate NAMM happening on the Saturday, where Buchla and a bunch of other companies have decided to run their own show during Saturday, including a lot of modular companies. So that's going to be interesting as well.
Before we wrap up, I just want to say thanks for joining, everyone. We had quite a decent number of people streaming along, and I'm sure a lot more watch this in the future. But some really nice questions being asked too. So thanks for engaging. And look, it really does make it more interesting for us when sort of, those sort of focus questions come in, and really do appreciate people participating, because otherwise we just sort of talking to each other, which is fine. I love these guys, but it's great hearing from people about what they want and how they see things too. So I think you're going to have a lot of fun with the QVL if you decide to add it to your system. And sure, it works great with the vector. Doesn't have to work with the vector, but yeah.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you online and at the next stream.
Brilliant.